Okay, mixing and mastering. So you probably all know that this class is downstream of what we do in my other class, audio recording, which is basic tracking. And generally speaking, you do some editing, but signal processing is sort of in between. Some of it is done while tracking, and some of it is done while mixing. But essentially speaking, mixing takes place like once these things of your audio project have been completed, and now it's time to balance your sounds and try to make a coherent audio project designed to connect with your fellow human beings. Then, once you got your mix together, then you do have to polish up the stereo track itself, and that's generally referred to as mastering. It's like where the sounds are finalized. In the realm of our DAW, it's like this stuff over here when you're adding effects and you're changing the levels and trying to find a balance, panning, that's the mix. And then this business over here is mastering. I haven't spoken too much about mastering, and I haven't necessarily required you to master all your projects. But moving forward, I do want you to make sure that you have a mastering signal chain to ensure that you are trying to add that little bit of polish onto your final projects. Okay. It used to be that engineers would record and mix their sounds, but then when it came time to master, they would send it out to a whole nother studio, like a whole nother engineer that was responsible for just that stereo file. Now, nowadays, most producers just do it wholly within the box. They are the mixers, they are the recorders, they are the masterers. I mean, that's how I do it. That's how most of you guys probably do it. But there is some value and some merit to the old system. First of all, you get another set of ears listening to your recording in an unbiased way. You may have noticed that you spend a lot of time and energy on your music, playing it and recording it and mixing it and signal processing it. You might get emotionally involved. You might love it too much. And really what you need is a person that doesn't care about you or your song to say, yeah, this is pretty funny. What are you thinking about here? This sounds bad. You need to rethink this part. And really, there's a ton of value there. So even if you are mastering with 100% in the box, I recommend that you encourage an unbiased ear to take a listen, because they might point out things that you missed. That being said, it's not really done this way anymore. You don't really send it out to a mastering engineer. It's expensive. They have their own special studios. But the value of an unbiased listen is probably the main thing that you're missing. Okay, it's kind of the heart and soul of music production, mixing and mastering. If you want to move forward with this pro audio stuff or be a modern musician, you should have a handle on this business. Okay, and then, of course, that is the definition of mixing and mastering. Mixing is balancing the individual audio tracks into a cohesive whole. And then mastering is the art and craft of refining that cohesive whole for commercial consumption. The easiest way to think about it, of course, is the visual. You're mixing over here, you're mastering over here. All right, I take it you guys are probably all on the level there. You probably know all of that stuff already. Okay, so I think that this material here is due only for once over. Tracking is whenever you're converting your sounds via microphones and transducers for storage. And then when you're more perfectly realizing your captured material you are editing, that typically comes down to doing this business. Like there was something wrong with this sound here, and I needed to do something of this sort. Like, yeah, that just wasn't working here. I needed to delete this and replace it with something else, or move it around, or change some other aspect of its physical nature. That's editing. To be distinct in your mind from the signal processing. So you might think that this is editing whenever you're doing this business here, when you're mixing. But really, you're just signal processing. You're adjusting the levels and the pan, and you're adding effects, and you're sending up a bus. That's signal processing, which is heart and soul of mixing. Whereas editing is you're physically manipulating the WAV files themselves. This stuff is basically considered to be all done by the time you get to the mix stage. Okay, you know, it is given as a list, but you must imagine that these processes routinely overlap. Sometimes you're doing a little bit of signal processing at the very beginning, and sometimes you're still tracking at the end of the day. Once you already have a mix and a master, you're like, dude, that guitar track just was not working, and you had to go back and track some more. That happens. It's unhappy when it does, but it does happen. Okay, so what we got to do once we are finally in the mixing stage is we got to try to construct an aesthetically appealing audio recording designed to connect with your fellow human beings. That means that the 60-some years, 70 years of pop music that has been produced is a good place to start, to listen to the music that has been produced professionally throughout the years. Because say what you want about it, it does appeal to a lot of people, and it connects with many, many people through its commonality of aesthetics. So that means that you don't want to get too lost in your own head when it comes to mixing and be too far out. You do kind of want to hone to what has already worked and try to experiment within that realm, because you want to connect with people. And if your mix is too esoteric or too oddly composed, people are just going to tune out and listen to what they want. Okay, so my list has one more on it than David Gibson's, but all he did was he summed dynamics into effects. But I think compressors and limiters and expanders and gates are important enough that they get their own list. Pan, dynamics, effects, and EQ at the level of the individual track. Like this track right here has some EQ. It's being sent, it's being panned to the right, it's this loud. I've managed to do almost everything on the list just within that one track. That's the idea. All of your various sounds in your mix, you'll have to at least consider for the volume, pan, dynamics, equalization, and effects. Now that's a lot if you have a lot of sounds in your mix, hence the logic of the template. The template is like, all right, let's just give you like a good place to start where this stuff is already more or less in place, and then you can adjust accordingly. It's like add salt to taste. All right, so those 5 things need to be approached for all of your sounds in the mix. I probably don't have to get a grant from the National Mixing and Mastering Foundation to make headway here. Volume just refers to the amplitude balance between the tracks. Panning is left to right. Dynamics is the compressors and limiters and expanders. EQ is volume at specific frequencies, mainly dealt with the equalization through the equalizer. And the effects refer to signal processors like delay, chorus, and modulation, and all the rest. Effects is sort of like and everything else you can do. Basically, we're using a lot of delays and reverbs. We're not doing too much with chorus and modulation, though some sounds do require a little bit of that special treatment, but not many. Effects kind of boils down to, in the simplest terms, is the ambient stuff. Like once you're trying to put it in some sort of space. All right, this is the most important concept about any mix. Whenever you're balancing your amplitude and you're separating your pan, you want to make sure that everything that you're listening to is intelligible. You don't really want a cacophony wall of sound that is impenetrable and hard to think about. If someone is listening to a loud and raucous rock band, then you want your loud and raucousness to be intelligible. Intelligible means able to be understood. That means that your mix is simple and plain and clear. If a listener wants to tune into your drum set, they can. If a listener wants to tune into your saxophone part, even though it's in the background, they can. Everything is nice and clear. Now, the main thing that fights against that is this business of masking, whereby one sound covers up and renders inaudible some other sound. And generally speaking, this happens with similar frequencies, like the kick drum and the bass guitar, say. They could potentially mask one another because they occupy the same frequencies. So too with other parts of a common mix. Right? If we have a mix that has a keyboard and a guitar, there's a good chance that they could be masking one another. Looks like this one is difficult to read. It might have other potential sources of masking. So the first order of business is to make sure that your mix is balanced well with these two guys, that your volume and pan have conspired to create a nice, intelligible mix. So you can, everything is plain and clear. It's not a wall of sound where the organ has morphed into the piano and they're just loud as possible and not differentiable. Dynamics also plays a role in intelligibility. Sometimes you might have to add some compression to get your sound to behave so that then you can accurately control its volume. Another one that plays a part in intelligibility, I guess, would be equalization. Sometimes you have to more perfectly realize the timbre of your sound. And that means getting your EQs out and trying to sculpt some sort of curve that more perfectly realizes your sound. One way to avoid masking and to enhance the intelligibility of your mix is to sort of lean into subtractive equalization, meaning that on the whole, most of your EQs, if you check them out, they're taking stuff away from your sound. Many have combinations, but even this one, if you added it all up, it looks like it's subtracting more than it's adding. If you get carried away with just pushing, everything's pushing, then essentially you're just like turning everything up, and your EQs are just acting like other volume knobs. And that's not really what you want to do. You sort of want to sculpt the sound for its timbre so that it's a more perfect version of itself. And that typically means subtractive equalization. Now, don't get me wrong, oftentimes the right move is to do additive equalization. You know, some sounds just need some boosting. But if you do subtractive equalization more than additive equalization, you'll probably get a little clearer mix with less masking and more potential for intelligibility. Therefore, greater potential for connecting with your fellow human beings with a nice, plain, clear mix. All right. Now, we've already talked about this with David Gibson, but the next step is that you need to sort of arrange what your sound hierarchy is. You know, some sounds play leading roles, some play supporting roles, some are in between, some are in the background. Okay, sounds that are typically front and center in the mix are the lead instruments, right? The vocals, sometimes piano, sometimes a string or a violin will be the lead instruments. And they're typically carrying the song's melody, right? This is the part that you sing along in the shower. Most pop music is lyrical, so obviously it's not hard to figure out who should be at the top of the pyramid. But really, it's the most important aspect of most music. You got to make sure your hierarchy of sounds is propping up and supporting that primary melody, no matter what it is. And then David Gibson's visualizations of mixes are useful here. You can see that he's got the 3 dimensions, up and down for EQ, back to front for volume and for ambience, left to right for panning. And notice that with these two mixes, the vocals just bang, here we go, right? And then some sounds are playing supporting roles, right? They're further in the background. Look at the pianos behind the saxophones, right? The cymbals are a little quieter than the snare. So not every sound needs to be bullying all of its neighbors and hogging up all the space. So many sounds just play supporting roles, right? Your rhythm section, right? Your guitar, bass, and drums, they should be back a little bit further from the lead vocal or the lead instrument. Though a lot of pop music does have a lot of presence with these sounds, generally speaking, they are still technically playing supporting roles. So it should be a little less loud and perhaps a little more ambient and less up front. Here's a neat thing that happens is sometimes who's playing the leading role is happening sequentially, meaning that the song started out with some singer or a rapper being right up front, and then halfway through the song it's an instrumental break, and then next thing you know, the saxophone's playing the lead. So when that happens, it's important that you hand the baton off like you're running a relay race, and that the sound occupies the same volume. So if I could just make a quick visual reference here, if I find some sounds that could demonstrate the concept. Let's pretend that these two sounds were in a relationship in which the top red one was playing a supporting role to the bottom red one, right? So its audio is more like this. This guy's reigning supreme. This guy's a little bit further in the background. But then the lead vocal ends, and it's time for this guy to take over. Now, you wouldn't do this at the level of your gain staging. You would do this at the level of your faders with automation. But then at that point, you need to hand the baton off, and this guy needs to reign supreme, and this one here needs to be now in the background. That does happen, but that doesn't mean that your overall mix has changed. Now, what would happen if you have a lead vocal establishing the king of the hierarchy, right? It's the lead sound, right? And it's got this nice superstructure of support and background. And now the lead vocal is over and it's time for the saxophone solo, but the saxophone solo is staying at the level of the supporting sounds, then you're going to have a hole in your mix. Your mix will decrease in amplitude, and the listener might be confused about what's even happening. At that case, you got to hand the baton off to the saxophone and make it occupy that same top of the pyramid. All right, that's pretty self-explanatory. I'm sure that you can intuit that. Okay. Here it is in a bullet point, creating a good mix. All right, so try to get a nice integrity and coherence to your performance. Everything's balanced just so. You've sculpted a David Gibson type visualization of your mix that is plain and clear. Your sound hierarchy is good. Then you want to place your sounds in a room or a hall so that you have some perspective. And remember, that is the domain of reverb and delay and even some panning. You can kind of imagine it like a performance hall. You close your eyes, the saxophone player is on the right, and then at the level of your mix, your saxophone player is also on the right. You've taken it and you've panned it to the right. Reverb and delay, of course, simulates the space so that you can imagine some sort of perfect performance scenario. Now, generally speaking, this comes down to not using a trillion different reverbs and delays. Just a couple, maybe one each for the instruments and one each for the vocals or whatever the lead instrument is. If you have too many different reverb settings, the intelligibility of your mix might suffer because now it's incoherent insofar as what band ever performs in different rooms from one another. Right? It just starts to make sense intuitively to our ear. There's just too many reverbs, too many delays, obscure the intelligibility of the mix. So when it comes time to sculpting perspective, try to use nuance and fewer reverbs and delay sounds. Okay, that material of the mix should be more or less on hand. Though you might have encountered some of these problems if you listen continuously, you might begin to make bad decisions with your mix because your brain is starting to compensate for the constant torrent of sound. You might be missing sounds that are there. You might be ignoring a cymbal crash that keeps happening that's not in your purview. You might even be kind of hallucinating self-generated ones insofar as imagining your hi-hat louder than it actually is. This is called accommodation, and it really does happen upon continuous listening. You got your headphones on, you've been mixing the same song for 3 hours. Some of this business is going to begin creeping in and messing with you and messing with your ability to mix. Unhappily, it doesn't stop there. There's also this business of fatigue. So not only are you kind of imagining sounds or self-generating sounds, your sense of hearing is also being eroded in the moment through a threshold shift, and you might begin to fatigue and have less reliable perception of what you're hearing. You might not be hearing the crystalline highs or the deep thudding lows as clear as you were at the beginning of your mix session. So unhappily, at the end of your mix session, you might begin making mistake after mistake and making bad decision after bad decision. Like, oh, here's bad decision number 1. Right? That ride needs to be all the way up here. All right. Bad decision number 2. This vocal is too loud. And then the next day you return to your mix and you're like, what in God's name was I thinking with that ride cymbal? It doesn't make any sense. Well, unfortunately, you were suffering through the problem of accommodation and hearing fatigue. All right, so the way to fix this and to counter this threat is to take frequent breaks. I don't know, like maybe after 15, 20, 25 minutes of mixing with your headphones on or with loud sound through monitors, go ahead and shut the DAW down, take a little walk, right? Think about something else. Absorb utter silence. Turn your headphones back on and see where you are. Try to listen in a quiet environment. It does you no good to mix if the furnace is running, if your roommates are watching TV, neighbors making sound with a lawnmower. You're not going to make good decisions under those circumstances. Try to limit overexposure to mid-range sounds. You're just spending all day trying to EQ the mid-range of your organ. You're just going to blast yourself into useless hearing fatigue, accommodation nightmare. So mid-range sounds, most sounds are in the mid-range. Everyone's vying for the mid-range. That part of the sound frequency spectrum really does wear and tear on your listening. Okay, and then most important, besides taking frequent breaks, is to make yourself a working mix. You can't just stay on your laptop. You can't just stay on your DAW. You can't just stay on your favorite set of monitors. What you got to do is make a rough draft of your song, which is to say export your mix down and take that rough draft to your telephone, take it to your laptop, take it to your grandma's hi-fi, take it to the car, take it to the best system on earth, take it to a PA system. Listen to it everywhere. And then what happens is your mix ends up being a kind of compromise scenario. We're like, well, there was too much bass when I listened on that PA system, but I want there to be enough bass to stimulate the iPhone speaker. So you kind of got to find a middle road there. Okay, so all of you have experience there, right? Trying to make some sort of coherent, made to contact your fellow human being, balance hierarchy of sounds by adjusting these 5 things of the individual audio tracks. Now comes time to more perfectly realize the final product. But now you have this stereo file at the end of the day, and this stereo file needs to be addressed through mastering. So it's just similar in definition. It's just the art and craft of trying to more perfectly realize that final track through equalization, maybe even increasing its amplitude, using some compression and limiting, sometimes adjusting the pan spread, using multiband compressors. Try to clean up all your sounds. You might want to more perfectly realize your EQ with an equalizer. And mastering engineers would use sounds like polished or raw or vintage. And this came down to what type of EQ you were using. I think that this version of Studio One did start providing vintage mixing consoles. Yeah, which is cool, and that might help you get like a classic sound. I think that I'm having trouble finding it at the moment. It might be just a setting, but that's what that's referring to. You know, if you want to try to use a simulated piece of equipment, like I want to use the Abbey Road mixing console from 1969, right? Something that's going to give you a sort of classic sound that you might enjoy. This would be the domain of, yeah. You want to use some old school mixing board. Hey, look at those giant faders. They're so awesome. Big fat EQ knobs, all those VU meters. This is what's meant by that. Now, generally speaking, I don't typically try to dial in a vintage or a polished sound, vintage sound. I do go for like kind of the modern polish. Right? Try to get it as clean and upfront and commercially consumable as possible. I would say that that's probably your primary objective with sculpting the EQ, with sculpting the timbre with EQ. Now, you may have noticed that not all mix projects are equally loud. Usually you do have to limit or compress to try to boost the song's overall amplitude to commercial levels. And that's why I always keep this guy here on the desktop of this computer. Trying to get this level of loudness so that you can compete and be as loud as modern productions. And that is also the domain of mastering. There's some differences here. Pop music is generally the loudest. Classical music and jazz, you don't have to push so hard. It might be a little bit better, for example, if you're producing classical music, is to aim for, I don't know, maybe somewhere around minus 18, right? Maybe even minus 20. So too with jazz. Maybe just a little bit dialed back, because those forms of music rely more heavily on dynamics. So dynamics in the realm of music is the journey from quiet to loud and back again. And jazz and classical music, they have a ton of that. So if you go crazy with the compressors, you are going to squeeze that type of excitement out of the music. Whereas pop music, R&B, rock and roll, hip hop, not as much of that. It's more or less one continuous loudness level throughout. Anyways, that's the domain of mastering, right? So you're trying to clean up the beginnings and the endings of the songs, wherein you set your loop bracket so that it starts at the right moment. Like, you don't want like an awkward amount of silence. Like, look at all that silence that transfers, right? So, and then the song starts here, and then the listener is just like slow rolling through 15 seconds of silence. They're going to turn your song the heck off, right? So you want to get it right here. So the person presses play, bang, the song starts. That's what's meant by the beginnings and the end. And also, you don't want like 1,000 minutes of stupid silence to roll on after your song's over. All right, so make sure you clean out the beginnings and the end. There's no distracting sounds. You've edited it all out. You EQ'd it to some sort of sound that you like, and then you've turned it up so as to compete with the modern pop music. Okay. So here's one more overall, or a overview of the business of decibels. So let's go to the two systems that will be most common in this class. This lecture also describes the sound pressure level, which is science class, and the dBu, which is the old school volume level. But here in the digital realm, we don't have to worry about those guys too much. We just need to worry about these two. So please try to strap on here, because this is what your level meter is giving you. So whenever you go to Studio One's level meter, and it's got all these buttons you can push, right? Peak RMS, K20, K14, K12, and then the European Broadcast Union. This is what it's talking about. This peak RMS, that is the normal way to refer to dBFS. This was the unit devised along with the invention of digital audio. It means decibels relative to full scale, and like the decibel volt before it, it works on 0 and negative numbers. The difference being that you can't push beyond 0 anymore without the meter clipping. And then look at this loud volume here, and notice that it's stopping right here at 0 and not going beyond. Whereas if you were using these VU meters in 1975, you'd be able to go to like 1, 2, 3, and it wouldn't ruin your sound. You would just get a little bit of saturation. Those days are over in the digital realm with the dBFS. We stop at 0 or we peak, right? That's the meaning behind, oh man, my master level is now red. What happened? Well, what happened is you went beyond 0 for your overall amplitude, thereby making it peak the meter. All right. dBFS. This is metered in two ways, and I believe that one of you guys got mixed up between the very tip of the iceberg and then where the average intensity is. So the average intensity is the RMS, root mean square. And that is basically what you're watching. As long as your peak meter isn't spiking beyond 0, you're in business. What you want to do is try to get that average intensity into this volume level that is approaching our commercial qualities, which, though measured in LUFS, do operate similarly insofar as they're an average. So if you get your peak RMS, or your RMS version of that, somewhere around -13, you're getting pretty close to the final reading. Okay, so then in maybe 2013, I think it was, not too long ago, a new unit was invented that corresponds to human perception. So instead of measuring your computer's bits like the DBFS does, this unit is designed to correspond to the human experience of sound. And this is the newest one. It's called LUFS, Loudness Unit Full Scale. Happily, guys, it works precisely like RMS. It's just, if you want to, just think of LUFS as just like another version of RMS. It's just another white dash hovering. Okay. Invented to stabilize the volume of loud TV commercials. You'd be falling asleep on the couch, watching reruns or whatever, and then next thing you know, somebody's yelling at you about buying a brand new car. And it's 3 times louder than the Star Trek rerun or whatever you were watching. People had enough of that. They're like, look, we got to stabilize this. So they invented this new unit. And that's where it comes from. And in our class here, our overall volume at the level of the master, we're going somewhere around here. Okay, somewhere between minus 14 and minus 11. And remember, it's an average. So it's going to be like wiggling and shoveling up and down. So you're never going to get like a steady minus 14. It's going to be somewhere in that range. So if your LUF meter is somewhere wiggling between minus 11 and minus 14, you're in business. You're doing pretty good. Know that YouTube normalizes at minus 14. So that means if you try to shove something up there that's mastered at minus 10, it's going to truncate and unhappily parcelate and cause digital pixelated distortion on your audio. And that's how the rest of the streaming services operate. If you try shoving something louder than what it's made to handle, you might get digital distortion. Though I think that their AI systems are beginning to correct for that to some extent. Err on the side of safety and try to stay within the realm of what they want. So if you're on Spotify and you got an account, just check their specs. Like, look what they want, see how loud they want it, and then conduct your mastering scenario accordingly. All right. So this is what I want you guys to do on your template, if you haven't done so already, is to configure a mastering sequence that you can work with, that's nice and simple, that looks something like this. Let's see if I have it on the... Nope. Okay, I got it here on the DAW. So unfortunately, I can't make this a little bigger. Maybe I can zoom in on the video. But if I look over here, the first thing I have upstairs is that Pro EQ. So if you remember with like the order of business with mastering, that's how you kind of sculpt your overall timbre, right? You want to get your sound first before you go squeezing the life out of it with your limiter. All right, so notice I got my EQ first, and then I have my limiter. Now, you might find some utility of flipping the script, but do know that you changed something else. Now the sound is being limited, and then the EQ is equalizing what's squirting out of the limiter. The idea is referred to as signal chain. And if you are a guitar player, you know this business with effect pedals. So if you have, your guitar is going into your tuner, and then it's going into this device, and then it's going into this device, right? And notice that this player here is preferring to have their equalization after their compression. But do know that it needs to be an intentional decision. Because the chorus, if you press that button, it's chorusing everything downstream. They're not discrete. One flows into the other. It's a series circuit. So it's the same business on your mastering chain. So everything that I've read has recommended that you get your EQ business together first. So that means your equalizer should be above your limiter. And then next up, I have this level meter. And do know that it's not a signal processor because it's not doing anything. It's just a speedometer, meaning that it's just telling you facts about your sound and not doing anything to your sound. So too with the spectrum analyzer, which looks like I forgot to add. Let me raise the roof here. I'm going to add the spectrum analyzer. Now you might think this is redundant because inside of the equalizer is a spectrum, is a spectrum meter. But the spectrum meter proper is a little bit more fidelity. QRS, DUV, WS, spectrum meter. Has various settings, giving you a visual description of the sound. Right? Beautiful. I like this one here. And then you see this hovering white dash? That's the equalizer's RMS, right? Isn't that nice? The reason that you might think that's redundant is if you dial up the EQ, you're like, the equalizer's like, dude, I got that right here. I suppose this one's a little nicer, especially since it's got more settings. Now, if you use Logic Pro, it has a mastering AI that essentially automates your equalization decisions, which sounds awesome and is awesome, but it does make what I'm teaching here a little useless. I think it's wise to know. The general concept is you want your spectrum meter to give you more or less a balance throughout the spectrum version of your audio. I don't know how to read this one. I like this one. Notice that like I'm pretty good here. Like I mastered this project fairly well. Like there's no goofy roller coaster dip. Let me show you what a goofy roller coaster dip would be. Like if you had some sort of upsetting EQ bite, right? Then you go to your spectrum meter, and then all of a sudden you're going to have a big old hole in your mix around 2000. Let's make it more severe for the purposes of demonstration. All right, so notice that the RMS now has like, right, it's going down the first dip of the beast, right, at Kings Island. That's not ideal. What is ideal is to manipulate your EQ curve so as to generate a flat EQ profile on your spectrum meter. That usually means, I mean, kind of like most recordings need a little love upstairs. Most recordings need a kind of filter here. And sometimes they need a little bite taken out of this guy. It's a common EQ curve. That also works for kick drum. You could spend hours, right? You could spend hours just mastering your sound with that equalizer, and there will be good results. You'll get a more polished sound if you put the time and effort into it. Okay, so once you've kind of sculpted your EQ the way that you like it, then the next step is to apply your limiting or your volume maximization and aim for something around -14. Okay, so this is kind of how I go about doing it. Unhappily, our limiter only measures in peak RMS, or the Bobcat system. There was a producer so famous for mastering in the 80s that he got his own system, Bobcats. Anyways, if you're old school guys, probably love this business. I don't use it at all. I use peak RMS. It doesn't mean that one system's bad and one system's good. It's just what are your preferences. In any case, I already got this kind of loud. Looks like I made some goofy changes that caused some peak. Oh yeah, it was me demonstrating stuff that caused the peak. All right, looks like it's giving me an RMS. Yeah, not quite. Oh, the song's over. Or the song broke down. Not quite there. I'm going to go with. I might go ahead and dial up my level meter and see what the business is doing with European Broadcast Union and the LUFS. So that's this guy here, EBUR128. That stands for European Broadcast Union. And then you press this LUFS button. Then it gives you several averages. INT is the slowest average. Then it's like a faster average, seconds, milliseconds, total peak. These are not as important as this. This is like your overall average over like a period of 15, 20 seconds, something of that sort. Notice where I am. I ain't there yet, am I? Almost, but not quite. The recommendation is 14 to 11. So, all right, limiter, do your magic. Okay, the magic move, as established by industry standards, is to set yourself a ceiling that's a little bit behind 0. So, technically speaking, the limiter is giving you a brick wall at 0, but you get with all this signal processing, you're pushing, you're EQing, you're mixing, you're mastering, you're panning, you're adding signal processing, some digital artifacts could creep in. So I've heard about -1 ceilings. Some people like -1 mastering. You're producing something insane. -3 mastering is not unheard of. That means that the limiter is like not even letting it get close to 0. However, the industry standard is this, -0.3. All right, so if you buy Isotope's mastering suite and you dial up its limiter, it has -0.3 in the default. All right, so that just means that instead of the limiter saying 0 is the brick wall, don't cross or else, it's like, just a little bit behind. Not much behind, but a little bit. A little bit that you have some carte blanche with this business. Now I got to push, right? Now I got to take this gain knob while I'm watching the RMS and notice that I'm getting some reduction. Looks like I'm pretty good now. All right? Averaging somewhere between -14 and -11. Notice that it's not giving you steadies, right? You kind of got to watch the hover. And to get perfect information, you do have to go to your level meter. I think Logic Pro probably solved this too. Doesn't their level meter? Yeah, I'll have to look at that. Yeah. They might give you a limiter with LUFS built in, which would be Superfly. Anyways, look, I'm doing pretty good, huh? Hit that reset a couple times. Maybe a little loud, huh? Then just go back. Oops, I turned it off by accident. Come on, limiter. And split the difference. I'm fairly certain I'd be in business there. And then that's it, more or less. Then you would go about making yourself one of those rough, you mixed and you mastered. Make yourself a rough mix. Listen to it in the car. Listen to it at grandma's house. Listen to it on your laptop. Listen to it on your phone. And then you might have to come back and do another mix and master. Did I give you guys a rubric? Might be another lecture. Okay. In a later lecture, I'll give you a way to think about this business overall. But that's the general thrust of it. So this is what I want you guys to do to your template in the meantime. And this will be all for today. You could sit and mix with the new stem package, but I'm out of steam. Can you create a mastering chain on your template? And if you want to get fun, you can throw this binaural pan on there. If you want to get super wide mixes, it's pretty fun. But do know that you might mess with the mono compatibility of your mix, meaning that it might sound weird on a Bluetooth speaker. All right, guys, thanks for listening to that, and